How's everyone doing? This is week 3, counterterrorism and terrorism, Intel 450. And today's topic will be terrorism evolution. Just want to say a couple of notes before we get started. I'll talk more about it at the exam next week. I'll post the questions. They're pretty straightforward. If you're going to answer the questions and do this for the posts as well, make sure that you have a specific thesis, that you want to say something and justify it. Say something like terrorism against military targets should not be, or attacks against the military should not be included as terrorism because of reason 1, reason 2, reason 3. Making sure you have a thesis, then you back up your thesis with evidence. And that's kind of what I'll be looking for on the midterm and the final, as well as the posts. So just want to make sure that's clear. For today's topics, justification, motivation, tactics of terrorism, I'm going to cover some history here and go before the jihadi period. Jihadi terrorism is covered in the news, it'll be covered in the rest of the class, but what I don't have is some of the historical underpinnings, so I'm going to make sure I cover that in this YouTube lecture. But some of the justifications in history that we've seen for terrorism are political goals. Almost every terrorist group has some sort of political goal. The second justification is anti-colonial activity, trying to get rid of the mother country from occupying your particular country. Anarchy, third justification. That's if terrorism is conducted, or if there's violence is conducted, it actually undermines the state for the sake of creating a sense of anarchy among the country at hand. And then the final kind of motivation is religious based, and that's what we're seeing now. So with that being the justification of motivation, historians have kind of grouped modern terrorism into 4 categories based on time period. And you'll hear this term, it's called the 4 waves of terrorism, 4 waves of modern terrorism. And the first wave occurred between about late 1800s to about 1920s, and this is called the anarchist wave of terrorism. And the motivations here were anti-government, anti-capitalist, nihilistic, anti-class acts of terrorism. This was just kind of the outgrowth of this was the robber baron period during the late 1800s and early 1900s, where it seemed wealth was concentrated in a few. So in response to this, anarchist terrorism came about, and they tried to focus on kind of that upper class of people. So we saw the acts of that in the United States and in Great Britain and at the time Russia, or pre-Soviet Union. And that kind of filtered out in the 1920s. The second wave of terrorism is the anti-colonial period, and I think this is where terrorism, the modern day terrorism, really has its roots. Anti-colonial time frame usually consider from about the end of World War II to the 1970s, late 60s, 70s, but there's certainly time periods where it's because some could make the argument that it's still happening now if you're a Palestinian terrorist or if you're IRA. But anti-colonial groups include the Mau Mau in Kenya, the FLN in Algeria, which we'll talk about in a second, and the Irgun in Israel following World War II. And I think that the big thing to think about from anti-colonial terrorism is that these were the first groups that used media to send their message. TV was just coming into prominence in the 50s, and the groups that were actually successful understood how to use terrorism, or how to use TV to multiply its message. The third wave of terrorism is the New Left terrorism, and this is started in the late 60s, 70s, and pretty much ends with the end of the Soviet Union. And again, this was a combination of Marxist terrorism, Soviet-sponsored terrorism. We saw acts in Germany, we saw acts in Europe, but also I would group to this secular Palestinian terrorism, specifically the Munich massacre in 1972, where Palestinians, supported usually by left-wing groups as opposed to religious-based groups, conducted attacks. And then the final wave we've seen since late 70s till present is religious Muslim extremist terrorism. And the key point of this is that as opposed to the other terrorist waves, this has a religious-based. Although there are political motivations, and there usually are, the religious base actually cause for increased attacks. And what I mean by that is, if you're a terrorist and you're guided by religion, achieving the political objective doesn't end your appetite for killing. And in fact, religion actually exacerbates your appetite for killing. And this is important to note because a lot of the terrorism literature before the religious-based terrorism said that terrorists were, they didn't want to kill a lot of people, they didn't want to cause a lot of damage because they didn't want to alienate their people. But if it's a religious base and you think you're going to the great pie in the sky after you're dead, you are not deterred, or you're not held back by these kind of scruples. So again, the four waves: anarchist, anti-colonial, new left, and religious, Muslim-based. And that's almost all terrorist acts in the earliest 21st century can probably be categorized among those four. So with that being said, I just want to cover two case studies, and I also want to say on your exam there'll probably be a case study, a question where you have to describe the motivations, justifications, achievements of a terrorist group and why it was successful or why it was not successful. So I'll say that right off the bat. But there's two case studies that I want to discuss that I think can really enlighten the terrorism literature, or your study of terrorism. The first is the Irgun. Irgun was considered now a terrorist organization. It was a pro-Jewish group that came about really prior to World War II, but accelerated in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And their goal was to kick the British out, essentially kick the British out of what was Palestine at the time, what is now considered Israel, so they could form their own Jewish state. Very specific political objective. After the Holocaust, the refugees from Europe came to this area, and they found a pretty good following among the Irgun. And the Irgun is actually considered the first post-colonial terrorist organization. So they wanted to kick the Brits out, start a Jewish state, and towards the late 40s, or towards the later part of their existence, they also took an anti-Arab focus. But their primary goal was, again, to kick the British out. Their primary method was assassination. And their focus was on the British government apparatus in the Palestine territories. They didn't want to kill civilians. At first, they didn't even kill a lot of Arabs. Their focus was to increase the cost to the British for occupying Palestinian or Israeli territory. And you got to remember, at the time, the British had just come out of World War II. They had lost a lot of casualties. They had a lot of casualties. They lost a lot of prestige. They lost a lot of parts of their empire, and there was a certain desire among the British people to actually start turning inward. So any costs or any lives lost after World War II or in Palestine was seen as, to the British public, hey, this isn't worth it. So the Irgun understood that, and then they took advantage of that. The other thing about the Irgun is that, particularly its leader Menachem Begin, who would later become president or prime minister of Israel, they understood media. They understood how to use television, newspapers, to advance their cause. And they were really the first organization